Hey there folks, it's Blue here from Blue Bears Games, and this video will be the upgrade guide for the Hosts of Mordor Lord of the Rings Commander Precon. I had mentioned in the unboxing video that I'd be switching the commander for this guide from Sauron to Saruman, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I feel that this change alone will improve the overall flow of the deck and lower the average amount of mana needed for the rest of the build. The other thing that switching to Saruman does is it lowers us to just two themes that we need to focus on. Spellslinger, which would be the main focus, and the Amass Orcs mechanic with a small Orc and Goblin tribal/typal sub-theme. The only issue that I have with the Amass Orcs mechanic is that you only get one creature at most out of it unless you copy the token. I didn't want to do that, so that's the reason for the higher amount of actual Orc and Goblin cards for this guide. Normally, Spellslinger decks have a lot less creature cards taking up spots, but Saruman is a little unique and required some extra creatures. Don't worry though, it will all mesh well together in the end. For last week's upgrade guide, I had 21 cards that I had to suggest to change out, and I thought, and frankly I hoped, that that number would be lower for this deck, but sadly it was not. For this guide, I actually have 22 cards to suggest, so we better get to it. Real quick though, before I get to the guide, I want to take a moment to remind you that if you're in the market for a pretty awesome looking deck box, playmat, or sleeves, please visit our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and take a look at what they have. Their deck boxes are some of the best that I've ever used, and you can even get an additional 5% off of your entire purchase if you use discount code BLUEBEAR at checkout. Now with that out of the way, let's begin. I'll start by telling you which cards I'd suggest taking out first. I already said to remove Sauron Lord of the Rings for Saruman, so with that, I'll also suggest removing the Reanimator aspect as well. I can't remove all of it, because then I'd basically be removing most of the initial deck, and I don't want to do that. So with that in mind, I'd also suggest removing the following: 1 island, 1 swamp, 1 mountain, Ever-Flowing Chalice, Commander Sphere, and Worn Power Stone, because as usual, the deck out of the box had too many mana sources, and I'm lowering the average mana cost of the entire deck down by quite a bit. The cards I'll suggest to swap in shortly will also be much better for the deck's new direction. Then I'd remove Goblin Cratermaker, Inferno Titan, Nullspine Dragon, Rampaging War Mammoth, Cavern Horde Dragon, Troll of Khazad-dûm, Voracious Fell Beast, Notion Thief, and the Balrog of Moria, because not only do most of these have a hefty mana value, but they also don't really fit the new direction that I'm taking this deck in. And finally, I'd also remove Boon of the Wishgiver, Reanimate, Living Death, Extract from Darkness, Too Greedily, Too Deep, and Shiny Impetus, because aside from the reanimation spells, which I mentioned earlier that I'd be removing, the rest are just not good, and I'd probably never include them in any deck unless they fit a main theme of a build. Even then, I'd probably struggle to include them. So that's the 22 cards that I would suggest taking out. I know that a lot of people prefer keeping Sauron as the general and turning this into a full-on reanimator deck, but I don't like that Sauron costs 8 to cast initially, and that its reanimating ability is solely an on-cast trigger, so I decided to go in a different direction. That's actually why I always say that this game is so great though. You can basically do anything you want, and what I'm about to show you is how I personally would go about running this deck. Now, before I show you the cards that I would swap in, I want to remind you that if you want mana fixing land upgrade suggestions, check out the upgrade guide video that I did for the Forces of the Imperium Warhammer 40k Precon. At the top of your screen is a link that you can use to go to the video, and I have timestamped the guide in the description of that video so you can easily find it after you're done watching this video. Now with that out of the way, let's begin. I'll start this off by showing you 2 lands that I feel would be great replacements. First up is a card called Barad-dûr. I like this land a little because it can come into play untapped, but I like it a lot because it provides a repeatable way to amass orcs that's sorely needed. The other land that I like is called Minas Morgul Dark Fortress, and I like it because it provides a way to give any creature evasion permanently that's similar to horsemanship called Shadow. Shadow is an older mechanic, and creatures with the Shadow ability aren't heavily used, so essentially it's like simply making a creature unblockable permanently. Continuing with mana sources, I have 2 mana rocks that I like way better than what came in the box. First up is Chromatic Lantern, because it helps fix mana better than almost any other rock currently available. It also taps to add mana of any color as well, which further helps smooth out your mana base, which is sorely needed in any 3+ color deck. The other mana rock that I like is called Sonic Screwdriver, which I really like for this new direction because you can get that army token really big quickly, so having another way to make it unblockable can really help get a lot of damage through that you may need to win a game. The fact that it also taps to add a mana of any color, plus has two other relevant abilities, is just icing on the cake. Next up are 5 creatures that I think will help improve the Amass, Army, Orc, and Goblin aspects of the deck. The first creature I'll suggest is Sauron the Dark Lord, because this version of Sauron actually helps advance the theme of both the original deck and the new direction that I'm going for. It's cheaper to cast than the one that the deck came with, has way more ability to amass orcs more often, and can even help refill your hand with more cards if you need it to. Honestly, I feel like this should have been the Sauron that they used for this precon. The second creature that I'll suggest, whose name I'm probably going to butcher horribly, is called Mar-Her Uruk-hai Captain. I liked this card because it helps make your army token very large very quickly. I didn't add anything to the build that would add counters to other things though, but if you do, this will help that out a lot as well. The third creature I'd suggest is Wargrider, and I liked this because it's sort of a lord for your orcs and goblins. It gives them all a form of evasion called Menace, which is helpful, but it also is another way to amass orcs for you repeatedly, but now for free. The fourth creature I'd suggest is called Moria Marauder. I like this one because it gives your orcs and goblins value. With this out, anytime one of your creatures deals combat damage, you get an opportunity to play cards from your deck, and that's really important in any game of Magic. It's not as good as drawing cards, but it's close enough. The fifth and final creature is called Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch. This card feeds more into the Spellslinger aspect of the build by getting you spells that you've possibly already cast back from your graveyard to your hand. It also helps whittle each opponent's health down every time you cast an instant or sorcery that it possibly even got back for you. What's not to love? The next section of cards I'll go over will be instants and sorceries. I've got 8 to show you that I felt helped the new direction out by taking advantage of Saruman's Spellslinger ability. Up first is a card called Assault on Osgiliath. I believe that this card could possibly be a game-ending spell akin to some green spells like Overrun. Giving all of your creatures double strike and haste is not exactly the same as giving them a stat buff and trample, but with the inclusion of things that give your creatures evasion or just make them completely unblockable, the results should be the same and possibly game-ending. The second card that I'll show you for this section is a sorcery called Ring Sight. I was a little shocked that a card that's literally a tutor for 3 mana was so monetarily inexpensive, but that may be because it's entirely dependent on having a legendary creature in play to work. I do believe there are enough legendary creatures in the deck to make this a viable option to use though. It is Commander after all, and you always have access to a legendary creature out of the command zone. Up third for this section is a card called Expressive Iteration. I felt like this deck needed better card draw or card draw-like spells, and while this card won't fix that entirely, it's a start. Truth be told, I'd replace all of the red loot style spells and replace them with cards that are similar to this, but I'm already replacing a quarter of the deck in this video, and going any further would make the original deck almost unrecognizable. You're free to do so though if you'd like. The next 3 cards I'm going to show you are good spot removal cards for this color combination. I'd go with Dreadbore because it's only 2 mana and can remove one of 2 different threat types. Molten Collapse because again it's only 2 mana but can now remove up to 2 things, and one of those things can be an opposing Soul Ring among other things. And the third spot removal card I'd suggest adding is Bedevil because it can remove one of 3 things but now at instant speed. The 7th card for this section that I'd suggest is another possible game ender, but in a slightly different way than the previous one. It's called Chandra's Ignition, and I like it because you can utilize that giant army token to possibly eliminate a few or even all of your opponents without having to even attack with that army. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to have an army token with 40 power, but over the course of a long game, health totals could drop to a number where your army token's power could be lethal to some or even all of your opponents. And the last card that I'll show you for this section is called Jeska's Will. Normally, I don't like to suggest cards that are this expensive, but this card has recently been printed in 2 Commander precons, so it's a little more accessible than a lot of other almost $20 cards. The utility of this card is quite high. It can give you ramp, access to cards off the top of your library, or, hopefully, both when you cast it. This card is one of, if not the best target to keep returning to your hand with the Exalted Flamer. Now, the great thing about Saruman is that the first ability actually says whenever you cast a non-creature spell and not specifically an instant or sorcery. So, we even get a trigger from casting other things, like enchantments, so let me show you a couple of those that I think would be great inclusions. The first one is a new card called Case of the Ransacked Lab. I like this card because it's cost reduction for your instants and sorceries, which can be better than ramp in a lot of scenarios. I'm not sure how likely you are to solve the case part of this card, but it is possible, and if you do, this could actually be one of the best cards in the deck. The other enchantment that I'd suggest is called March from the Black Gate. There's nothing really fancy about this card, it's just another possible way to repeatedly amass orcs for you. Now, as far as a combo I want to suggest, this was a little harder to come up with than I thought it would be. I wanted to stay on theme for the deck, and take advantage of Saruman's Spellslinger-friendly ability to amass orcs as much as possible, and I think I've come up with the perfect solution. Isochron Scepter with Dramatic Reversal imprinted on it. I know that sounds boring, and unless you control enough mana rocks that you could produce more than 2 mana total, it's a net 0 gain, but hear me out for a second. Even if you only have enough mana rocks to produce 2 mana, and Saruman is in play, at least you get infinite cast triggers of a non-creature spell, which will result in infinite amass triggers. If you happen to control enough rocks to produce 3 mana though, now you can also produce infinite mana, and you have options for what to do with it from there. Since I like to try and stay on theme as much as possible, I'm going to suggest adding a card named Fall of Kair Andros. This card is both a mana sink that helps clear out opposing creatures, and is also an additional way to amass orcs repeatedly. See? I told you to hear me out. There are many other things that you could do with infinite mana, and I'm sure you will have something else that you would like to do instead, but I would give this a try and see how it works out for you. And that, my Hobbit-loving friends, was my upgrade guide for the Hosts of Mordor Lord of the Rings Commander Precon. While everything that I just suggested may not make this deck competitive, it sure will make it a lot more fun to pilot. Out of the box, I wouldn't enjoy playing this precon, but I would enjoy it with all of the changes I just went over. There are definitely other changes that you could make, especially with the card draw, but as I mentioned earlier, that would take so much more time, and this deck would start to lose its identity, which I didn't want to do. So that's it for this guide. Let me know what you think of the changes in the comment section. As always, thanks for watching, and if you could, please do me the favor of giving the video a like, subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so yet, sharing this out to anyone you think would enjoy it or get anything out of it, and visiting our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and using discount code BLUEBEAR for an additional 5% off of your entire order if you decide to purchase anything from them. Now go and watch some of my many other videos to tide you over until next week, where I'll be doing this all over again for the third Lord of the Rings Commander Precon.